I'll never forget the day she stopped him. I was at the grocery store when I saw it happen. The man was tall, well-dressed, and looking every bit the millionaire. He had one of those expensive suits you only see on TV, with a briefcase in hand and a look of someone who owns the world. I watched him walk past me, his shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. But what really caught my attention wasn't his clothes. It was the little girl who was standing in front of him. She was about 5 or 6 years old, dressed in a simple pink dress, her hair in two messy pigtails. She looked out of place compared to the polished man in front of her, and for a moment, I thought she might be lost. The man barely noticed her at first. He was too busy scanning the shelves, like any other customer. But the girl didn't move, not until he reached the end of the aisle. She stepped up to him, her tiny hand tugging at the bottom of his suit jacket. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man turned around, clearly irritated, but his face softened when he saw her. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked, in that tone you use with kids when you're trying to be polite but not really interested. The girl didn't answer at first. Instead, she reached into her small hand and pulled out a wrinkled photograph. It was a picture of a woman, a young woman with dark skin and bright eyes. It was my mom. "That photo," the girl said, holding it out toward him. "It fell from your pocket." I froze. My heart dropped. The man looked down at the photograph, confusion flashing across his face. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes scanned the picture, and I could see him trying to figure out why a little girl was giving him something that clearly wasn't his. I stood there, watching, waiting for what would happen next. The girl repeated herself, a little louder this time, her small voice unwavering. "This photo, it fell from your pocket." She held it up again, and I could see her face starting to show signs of frustration. It was like she knew something that he didn't. The man finally took the photo from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers for a second. He looked at it, and I saw his eyes go wide. His expression shifted from confusion to something else, something darker. That photo wasn't just a random picture. It was one of the few pictures I had of my mom. She had died a few years ago, and I kept that photo in my wallet to remind me of her warmth, her love, her strength. I had no idea how it ended up in that man's pocket. And I had no idea what he was going to do with it now. I stepped forward, my hands shaking as I walked toward them. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing with that photo?" The man looked up at me, clearly startled. He seemed to recognize me, but I didn't recognize him. He quickly shoved the photo back in his pocket. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice suddenly defensive. It's not mine. I don't know how it got there." I was so confused. I didn't understand what was happening. Was he lying? Why would he have a photo of my mom? Why was it in his pocket? I looked at him closely, searching for answers in his face, but all I saw was a man who was caught off guard. The little girl, standing beside him, didn't back down. "I saw it," she said, her eyes locking with his. "It fell from your pocket. You were rude to my mom." She said you were rude. The man shifted uncomfortably. I noticed his hands tremble slightly, and for a second I wondered if he was scared. But then he looked at me, and the hardness in his eyes came back. "I think you should leave," he said, his voice cold. "You're making a scene." I could feel my face flushing with anger, but I wasn't about to back down. "You took something from me," I said, my voice shaking now, "and I want it back. I don't care who you are. This is mine." He glanced at the little girl, who was still standing her ground, looking up at him like she knew exactly who he was and what he had done. His face softened, just a little, before he sighed and pulled the photo out of his pocket. "Here," he said, handing it back to me. "I'm sorry for the trouble." I grabbed the photo from his hand, feeling the weight of it in my palm. It was my mother, smiling like nothing in the world could hurt her, the photo I had nearly forgotten about. But I wasn't finished. "Why did you take it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. "How did it get there?" The man's face twisted, like he was trying to figure out how much to say. After a long pause, he looked at the little girl beside him. She was still holding his jacket, still watching him like she could see right through him. I didn't take it on purpose, he finally muttered. It's a mistake. But maybe it was a sign. He shook his head, like he couldn't quite explain himself. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I knew that something wasn't right. The little girl had seen something I hadn't, something dark behind that man's perfect suit, behind his polished image. Thank you, I said to the girl, bending down so I could meet her eye. You helped me get this back. You did the right thing. She smiled at me, her eyes bright and full of something I couldn't quite describe, courage, maybe, or wisdom beyond her years. As the man walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something more than just an accidental photo exchange. There was a story behind that photo, and a story behind that man. The little girl might have just been a witness to something she couldn't fully understand yet, but she had done what no one else had done for Meshe, had stopped him, and she had made him answer. That moment, as strange and unexpected as it was, changed everything. The photo wasn't just a piece of my mom anymore. It was a reminder that sometimes we have to stand up, even when it seems like the odds are against us. Sometimes even a little girl can make a difference. I'll never forget the way she looked at him before he walked away, the way she made him feel like he was the one who had lost something. The days after that encounter stayed with me. It was hard to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my mind. How had the photo ended up in that man's pocket? What did he mean by it being a sign? And most of all, who was he really? I tried to go back to my normal routine, but I couldn't. There was something about that day, something about the way the little girl had so boldly confronted him, that wouldn't leave me. It was like she knew something about him, something I didn't understand. Maybe she had seen more than just a millionaire in a suit. Maybe she had seen a man who thought he could take what wasn't his. Maybe she had seen through the armor he'd built for himself, into the heart of a person who had done wrong and never faced the consequences. I kept thinking about her bravery, her confidence, the way she had stood up to him without a second thought. She didn't hesitate, she didn't fear him. She had done what I had been too afraid to do. And in that moment, I realized something. That little girl had reminded me of something I had forgotten, my own strength. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo. Every time I looked at it, I saw my mom. But now I saw something else too. I saw how precious it was. Not just because it was the only picture I had left of her, but because it was a symbol of something much bigger. It was a symbol of everything I had lost and everything I had yet to find. I started asking around, trying to figure out who the man was. I didn't know where to begin, but I had to know. Something inside me told me that he wasn't just some random stranger who had made an accidental mistake. There had to be more to it. There had to be a reason why he had taken that photo. A few weeks later, I found out who he was. It wasn't hard to track him down. His face was all over the news, his name mentioned in the context of a company that had been involved in a huge scandal. The more I read, the more I realized that he was the kind of person who thought he could take anything he wanted. Not just possessions, but power, influence. The photo had probably fallen out of his pocket by mistake, yes. But it wasn't just a photo. It was a reminder of something he had tried to erase, something he had tried to forget. I wasn't sure what to do with that knowledge. I had no proof that he was involved in anything illegal, nothing that could directly connect him to my mom's past. But what I did know was this. He had been careless. He had taken something precious, something that didn't belong to him, and for a brief moment he had been forced to confront. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let him walk away without an answer. But I wasn't going to confront him like the little girl had. No, I needed a different approach. I needed to dig deeper, to understand more. And maybe, just maybe, I would find out exactly why that photo had ended up in his pocket in the first place. I spent the next few months trying to uncover what I could about him, working late nights, talking to people who might know something. And slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle started to come together. I learned that his company had once been involved in a series of shady real estate deals. I found out that his wealth had been built on exploiting people who were desperate, people like my mom, people who didn't have a choice but to trust someone like him. And then I found it. A document that linked his company to a financial scheme that had ruined families, that had taken homes from people who had worked their entire lives to own them. My mom had been one of those people. She had lost everything because of him, and when I pieced it all together, it made sense why he had taken the photo. It wasn't just an innocent mistake. It was a reminder of something he had buried deep inside himself, a guilty conscience. That photo of my mom had been a symbol of everything he had destroyed. I confronted him a second time, but this time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't going to let him brush me off. I had proof now. I had everything I needed to show him that I knew what he had done. When I walked into his office, I could see the surprise in his eyes. He wasn't expecting me. I didn't let him say anything at first. I laid out the documents on his desk, the ones that connected him to the scheme, the ones that proved he had been the one responsible for the pain my family had gone through. "Do you remember her now?" I asked, my voice steady. "Do you remember my mom? The one whose picture you decided to keep in your pocket, even though it wasn't yours?" For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He shifted in his seat, trying to find words, but I didn't give him a chance. "You've ruined so many lives," I continued, my anger building, "and you thought you could just walk away from it. But you can't. Not anymore." He didn't try to deny it. He didn't try to make excuses. For once, he had nothing to say. I left his office knowing that I had done something important. I didn't bring him down in some dramatic way, but I had forced him to face the consequences of his actions. I had made him feel the weight of the life he had tried to destroy. And as I walked away, I thought of the little girl, the one who had helped me get the photo back. I thought about how, in that moment, she had made a grown man face something he didn't want to face. And how, in the end, that little girl had done more than anyone could have expected. She had reminded me that sometimes we don't need to be big or powerful to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is a little courage and the willingness to stand up for what's right. The days after I confronted him felt surreal. Part of me was still processing everything, the shock of finding out how deeply connected that man was to my mom's struggles, the realization of how long he had been able to hide behind his wealth and power. But the other part of me, the part that had been so afraid to stand up before, felt lighter. For the first time in years, I felt like I had done something that mattered. I had made him see my mom, see us, not as just some face in the crowd or a small, forgotten story, but as real people with real consequences attached to his actions. And yet, the weight of it all wasn't entirely gone. There was still the lingering question, what would happen next? What was I supposed to do with the knowledge I had? What would the fallout be? I didn't have to wait long for the answer. A week after I visited him, I received a letter in the mail. It was from his legal team, and my heart sank as soon as I saw it. I opened it carefully, my hands shaking a little. The letter was a threat veiled in polite corporate speak, of course, but the message was clear. They were offering me a significant amount of money in exchange for my silence, for dropping the documents I had uncovered. I laughed bitterly as I read it. The man had tried to buy his way out of his guilt, tried to silence me with money, thinking it would make everything go away. He thought I was just another person with a price. I didn't respond to the letter immediately. I needed time to think, to figure out what my next move would be. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to take the money. I wasn't going to let him erase what had happened or buy his way out of it. I went to the news instead. It wasn't easy. The media had their own agenda, their own narratives to push, and I was just one small person trying to make noise in the middle of a much bigger story. But I had the truth, and I had evidence. The journalists were skeptical at first, especially when they saw how little I had, just a few documents and my word against a millionaire with a network of lawyers. But the more I told them about my mom, about her fight, about how she had tried to get justice before her life was stolen from her, the more they began to listen. I gave interviews. I spoke on camera. And each time I felt a little stronger, a little more like I was doing something that mattered. The media picked up the story. And before I knew it, the truth about that man's company, the real estate schemes, the manipulation, and the destruction it caused, was out in the open. His empire started to crumble. Lawsuits piled up, and people began to come forward with their own story. It turned out He wasn't just responsible for my mom's loss, there were many others, people he had hurt and discarded. The weight of it all became too much for him to carry. I wasn't the only one who had stood up to him. There were others like me. People who had been silenced, too scared to fight back, until they saw someone else do. The little girl's bravery had started a chain reaction, one that I never could have anticipated. And when his company faced a massive public reckoning, I realized how much power there was in simply speaking the truth. It didn't happen overnight. The legal battles took years. The media moved on to the next big story, but the fight continued in the background. Every so often, I would see a headline or hear a report about another lawsuit or another victim speaking out. Each time, it reminded me of how far we'd come, how many people had been empowered to stand up because we didn't stay silent. And in the quiet moments, when I held my mom's photo, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The weight of everything that had been taken from her, from me, didn't feel so heavy anymore. Because even though she was gone, her legacy lived on in the fight that had been sparked by that photo, by that one little girl who had reminded us all that no one is too small to make a difference. I thought about that girl often. How many other people would have stayed quiet, letting the man walk away without a second thought? But she didn't. She stopped. She spoke up, even when no one else did. And in that moment, she was the one who showed me that sometimes the power to change the world isn't in money or power. It's in courage, in standing up, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. I never saw that little girl again. I don't even know her name, but I'll never forget her. Because in a world where it's easy to feel invisible, she made sure that someone like me was. And that made all the difference. As time went on, the case against the millionaire dragged on in the courts. The news cycles came and went, but I stayed committed to seeing it through. There were moments when I felt exhausted, when it seemed like the fight wasn't moving fast enough, or when the weight of the years of legal battles became too much to carry. There were days I doubted myself, wondering if I had made the right choice by refusing the money, wondering if I should have just walked away and let things go. But then I would remember my mom's face, frozen in that photo, and the little girl who had given me back something I thought I had lost forever. One day, as I was sorting through some old papers at home, I found a letter from my mom that I had forgotten about. It was tucked inside a box of memory-sold birthday cards, ticket stubs from family vacations, and things I hadn't looked at in years. The letter was written in her neat handwriting, the kind of handwriting that always looked like it was carefully thought out, even when it was just a grocery list. It was addressed to me, and it was from when I was a teenager. I had written something about how frustrated I was with the world, how I hated the way people treated us black families, poor families, and how I couldn't understand why things seemed so unfair. I had felt so small, so powerless back then, and my mom's words, written all those years ago, hit me like a wave. You are stronger than you think. The world may try to make you feel small, but never forget that even the smallest voice can echo in ways that will be heard. You can fight, and you will win, even when you think you've lost. Never let them silence you. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't realized until that moment just how much her words had shaped me. She had believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And now, years after her death, her belief was still guiding me, still reminding me of the strength I had within. I had fought for her, for what she had lost, and in a way I was fighting for that little girl too. She had believed in me before I even knew how to believe in myself. She had seen something in me that I couldn't see, and together we had stood up to someone who thought they could get away with destroying lives. The fight wasn't over, not yet, but I knew I wasn't alone in it anymore. I had the support of so many people who had come forward, who had found their own courage to speak the truth. And I had the memory of my mom, who had always taught me that even when it felt like the world was against you, you had to keep pushing. I started speaking at rallies, joining others who were working to hold the man accountable for the harm he had caused. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the countless others who had been affected by greed, by exploitation, by a system that allowed people like him to thrive while destroying those who had nothing. It was hard work. The fight was never easy. But I realized that the hardest part wasn't the battles in the courtroom or the media. The hardest part was remembering to keep going, even when everything around me seemed designed to make me stop. Every setback, Every time I felt like I couldn't take another blow, I thought of my mom and that little girl. I thought of all the people who had been hurt by the man's actions, and I couldn't stop. And then, one day, it finally happened. The verdict came down, and the man was found guilty of fraud, embezzlement, and dozens of other charges. His company collapsed, and he was sentenced to prison. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one I could celebrate. There was no joy in seeing him behind bars. The damage he had done couldn't be undone. The lives he had ruined couldn't be magically fixed. But there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that his reckoning had command, that I had played a part in making sure that it did. The little girl was right, even if she didn't fully understand what she had done. She had seen the truth before anyone else did, and she had made sure that the truth couldn't be buried. I never found out where she went after that day. I don't know if she ever knew how much her small act of courage had meant, or how it had sparked something in me that I didn't know was there. But I hope she knows that she didn't just give me back a photo, she gave me back my strength, and she reminded me of the power we all have, even in the smallest of moments, to change the world. The journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Not just because of the justice that came in the end, but because of the people I met along the way, the people who reminded me that we can fight, that we can make a difference, and that we are never as powerless as we feel. And as I walked away from the courthouse after the trial, I thought about that little girl again. She didn't need anything grand to change the course of everything. All she needed was the courage to speak up. Months passed, and life started to find a new rhythm, though I would never forget the lessons I had learned. It was strange to walk down the street, hear about the millionaire's downfall, and know that I had played a part. There were days when I could almost feel my mom with me, her voice, her strength, the belief she had in me, even when I wasn't sure I had the strength to believe in myself. It was like her spirit was still guiding me through the hardest times, reminding me that no matter what I faced, I had something worth fighting for. But even after everything that happened, a part of me still felt unsettled. The legal battles were over, the media had moved on, and the man who had hurt so many was behind bars. Yet the feeling of injustice of how much he had taken from us and so many other slingers. One afternoon, as I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop, sipping on a cup of tea, my phone rang. I wasn't expecting any calls, especially not on a lazy afternoon like this. I looked at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number, one I didn't recognize. For a split second, I thought about ignoring it, but something told me I should pick. "Hello," I answered, my voice cautious. There was a brief pause before the voice on the other end spoke. It was a deep, familiar voice, one I had heard many times before but had never thought I'd hear again. "Is this the woman whose mother's picture I once took?" he asked. It was him. The man. The million. I felt a chill run through me. I had been expecting a call, but not like this. I had spent so long fighting him, so many hours devoted to making sure he faced the consequences for his actions, that hearing his voice now, after all this time, left me frozen. "You're calling me now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "After everything?" He sighed, a long, slow sound like someone who had been carrying a weight for far too long. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice almost unrecognizable. There was no arrogance in it now. There was no sense of superiority. He sounded human, vulnerable. I wasn't sure what to say. A part of me wanted to hang up, to tell him he was too late, that nothing he could say could change the past. But another part of part, that had been fighting for so long, knew I couldn't just ignore this. "Why now?" I asked. "Why after everything? After all the damage you caused?" "I've spent months thinking about it," he said, the words coming slowly. "About you, about your mother, about the photo. It wasn't just a picture, it was a symbol. A reminder of all the things I did wrong, and I didn't know how to face that. I didn't know how to make it right." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man who had built his life on lies, who had stolen from so many people, was admitting that he had been wrong. It wasn't an apology I had ever expected. It wasn't even something I had wanted. But in that moment, I realized it wasn't about whether I forgave him. It was about him finally seeing the truth that had been there all along, even when he tried to bury it. "I don't know what you want from me," I said, trying to hold on to the anger that had driven me for so long. "What do you think this apology will do?" "I don't expect forgiveness," he replied. "I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I took from you. I see what I took from so many people and I can't undo it. But I want you to know that, in some small way, you changed. For a long time, I didn't speak. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't expected this conversation. I hadn't expected him to acknowledge the truth in the way he had. But in that moment, I realized something. His apology didn't change the past. It didn't take away the pain or the years of struggle or the years my mom had spent fighting to stay afloat. But it did something else. It reminded me that the power to heal didn't lie with him. It lay with me, and with all the people who had been hurt and silenced by people like him. I took a deep breath, my heart heavy but my mind clear. I don't need your apology, I said finally. What I needed was for you to face what you've done, for you to see it and understand the harm you caused. And you've done that. So, I guess, in a way, we're even. He didn't respond right away, and for a moment, I wondered if he was still on the line. But then he spoke again, softer this time. I'm sorry, he repeated, for everything. I ended the call without saying another word. I didn't need to hear anything more. His apology, though unexpected, was enough for me. It didn't change the past, it didn't make it right, but it gave me something I hadn't realized I still needed. Closure. I put my phone down, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me. The fight hadn't been in vain. The years of struggle, the anger, the loss, it had all led to this moment. I had fought for my mom, for the people who had been hurt, for the truth. And even though it wasn't always easy, even though the world had tried to push us down, we had. I thought of that little girl again, the one who had stopped the man in the store, who had given me back my mom's photo. She had shown me what it meant to stand up, even when the world didn't want to hear you. And in the end, that's what mattered. We may never be able to change everything, but we can change something. We can change ourselves, our hearts, and how we choose to move forward. And that was all I needed to know. In the end, the fight wasn't just about exposing. It was about finding my own voice, my own strength, and remembering that no matter how small we might feel in the face of injustice, we all have the power to change the world one moment at a time. Months passed, and life continued to move forward, though it felt different now. I wasn't the same person I was before all of this began. There was a quiet strength in me that I hadn't known existed. I had seen firsthand how something as small as a photograph, a simple moment of courage from a little girl, could set off a chain of events that changed everything. And that power, no matter how subtle, had changed me. But the effects of that fight weren't just internal. The case had drawn attention to a larger issue: how power and money were often used to silence and oppress those who couldn't fight back. People began to talk more openly about the corrupt systems that allowed people like the millionaire to thrive at the expense of others. More voices came forward, more stories were shared, and it became clear that this fight was about something much bigger than just one person. I started working with a group of advocates who were helping other families who had been hurt by similar injustices. It wasn't easy. There were times when I felt overwhelmed by the weight of it, but I kept going because every step forward was another piece of the puzzle, another way to keep the fight alive. One afternoon, I was sitting in a community meeting, discussing ways to support families impacted by the same kind of exploitation that my mom had suffered, when I heard a familiar voice. I turned around, and to my surprise, it was the little girl. She was standing by the door, looking shy but determined. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I wanted to say thank you." The room went silent. Everyone turned toward her, and I couldn't help but smile. She looked exactly like the girl I remembered from that day in the grocery store's mall, but fierce, with a spark in her eyes that said she wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. "You're the one who—" I trailed off, still in awe of the fact that she had somehow ended up here, in the same space where I had been fighting for so long. She nodded, her expression serious. "I know it's been a long time," she said, "but I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what happened that day. I've been thinking about how you fought for your mom, for what was right." I stood up, feeling a lump form in my throat. This wasn't something I had expected, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. It was validation, not just for my struggle, but for the countless others who had been swept under the rug for so long. It was proof that standing up, speaking out, mattered more than we could ever know. "Thank you," I said, my voice catching. "You were the reason I didn't give I stood up, feeling a lump form in my throat. This wasn't something I had expected, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. It was validation, not just for my struggle, but for the countless others who had been swept under the rug for so long. It was proof that standing up, speaking out, mattered more than we could ever know. "Thank you," I said, my voice catching. "You were the reason I didn't give up. You gave me back my mom's photo, and that meant more than I can explain." She smiled, a soft, knowing smile, as if she understood exactly what I meant. "I knew it was important, and I wanted to make sure you had it." The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in. I realized as I looked at her that we had both been part of something larger than ourselves. That little girl had changed my life, just as I had changed hers. "You don't have to thank me," she said, looking down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. It was the right thing to do. And in that simple statement, I understood. It was the right thing to don't out just for me, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, powerless. It was a reminder that courage isn't something that comes in grand gestures. It can come in the form of a simple act, a word, a gesture, a photo falling from a pocket hand when we choose to act. It has the power to ripple out in ways we can't even imagine. She stayed for the rest of the meeting, quietly listening as we discussed ways to help the families who were still struggling. Afterward, she slipped out, just as quietly as she had come in, but I knew she wouldn't be forgotten. Not by me, not by anyone. As I watched her walk out the door, I realized something else, that this fight, this journey wasn't just mine to finish. It belonged to everyone who had been a part of it. Every person who had spoken up, every person who had fought for what was right. The battle for justice wasn't just one fight. It was ongoing, and it was passed down from person to person, generation to generation, and we all had a role to play. I held my mom's photo again that evening, feeling the weight of it in my hands. I no longer felt the deep, aching sorrow I had once felt when I looked at it. Now, it was a symbol of resilience, of love, and of everything that had been fought for. It was a reminder that no one's life, no one's story, should ever be erased, no matter how hard others try to bury it. The fight was far from over, but I had learned something important through it all. The power to change the world doesn't lie in some grand gesture. It lies in the small, everyday acts of courage, in the decision to stand up, even when it's hard. And when we choose to stand together, when we choose to share our stories, the world can be changed one voice at a time. And as long as there were people like that little girl, like my mom, like all of us who refused to stay silent, I knew we had a chance. We would keep fighting for justice, for truth, for every person who needed to be seen, heard, and remembered. The journey wasn't over, but with each step, we were getting closer to a world where no one had to fight alone. Years passed, and the ripples from that day continued to spread, touching lives in ways I could never have imagined. The work I'd started helping families, speaking out against injustice, had turned into something bigger. What started as a personal fight had blossomed into a movement, fueled by the countless stories of others who, like me, had felt the weight of injustice and had chosen to speak out. I kept in touch with the little girl, though our interactions became less frequent over time. She had grown into a young woman, one who now carried the same fire in her heart that I once had as a child. She was attending school, studying law, and already dreaming of ways to continue the fight for justice. She would sometimes reach out to me, sharing her thoughts, asking for advice, or simply telling me about a case she had read about that reminded her of everything we had gone through. It felt like a full circle moment to hear her talk, knowing that she had once been the one to spark everything for me, and now she was taking her own steps toward making change. And while I kept fighting for others, something inside me began to shift. The battle for justice, for the truth that had been buried for so long, was no longer the sole purpose of my life. I had carried it for years, fueled by anger and a sense of urgency. But as time went on, I began to see that healing wasn't just about fighting for what was lost, it was about finding peace within myself. There were still moments of pain, of course. The memories of my mom, the emptiness of losing her, those wouldn't ever go away. But I had come to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting it, meant learning to live with the grief and the lessons it brought. It meant finding joy in the little victories, in the quiet moments, in the people who stood by you through thick and thin. One evening, I found myself standing in front of my mom's old house, the place where we had struggled together, where we had fought to keep our lives intact despite everything that had tried to tear us apart. I hadn't been back in years. The house was empty now, abandoned. A faded version of the home I remembered. The walls had once echoed with laughter, with arguments, with dreams. Now they stood silent, weathered by time and neglect. But I wasn't sad as I stood there. I was grateful. Grateful for the lessons, for the strength my mom had shown me, for the fire she had passed on, even in her absence. I knew she was with me in every step I took, every decision I made, guiding me in ways I couldn't always see. As I walked away from the house, I realized something. The fight for justice, for truth, was never about the destination. It was about the journey. It was about the people who walked with you, the lessons you learned along the way, and the small moments of triumph that made it all worth it. The work wasn't finished, not by a long shot. There were still lives to be changed, still stories to be told. But I knew now that we didn't have to carry the weight of it all on our own. The little girl had shown me that in a way when she stepped forward that day in the store. She had reminded me that we don't always need to fight alone, we can find strength in each other, and when we do, we can create change that lasts. I took a deep breath as I looked out at the horizon, the setting sun casting a warm glow across the sky. The world was full of challenges, but it was also full of hope. The fight would never be easy, but as long as we kept showing up, as long as we kept fighting for what was right, there was always the possibility for something better. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest victory wasn't in winning every battle, it was in knowing that we had done everything we could to make the world a place where people's stories mattered, where their voices were heard, and where justice wasn't just a dream, but a reality for all. So I kept moving forward, not just for myself, not just for my mom, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or forgotten. And as I walked into the future, I knew one thing for sure. I would never stop fighting.